Senator Schumer is slightly schizophrenic on, he quotes Bill Maher. That's your authority? I mean, why not quote Destiny? At another point, in order to disqualify the chanters of From the River to the Sea, Palestine will be free, a slogan which I don't like, I've made clear I don't like, but that's beside the point. This land is mine. God gave this land to me.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount to the link given in the description box. We rely on you. Without further ado, let me welcome Professor Norman Finkelstein. Professor Finkelstein is a renowned scholar on Palestine. His most famous book is titled Gaza: An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. And his latest book is titled I Will Burn That Bridge When I Get to It: Heretical Thoughts on Identity Politics, Cancel Culture, and Academic Freedom. And today, Professor Finkelstein is with us to discuss American Senator Chuck Schumer's latest book on anti-Semitism in America, A Warning. Professor Finkelstein, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't you give your first impression or a set of thoughts about the book you just read, and we can take it from there.
Yes, my initial thought is, or my initial thoughts are, how unserious it was. Chuck Schumer was a very smart fellow. He's been involved in politics for the whole of his adult life. He's currently the Senate Majority Leader, and he has been a fervent, vociferous supporter of Israel. I'm not so sure if it's the whole of his adult life, but certainly a significant a portion of it. And so one would have expected, given his experience in politics, his impressive academic pedigree, that you would have had something more substantial than what he produced. And that, of course, then poses the question why he wrote the book. And I think we should return to that at the very end. We'll try to keep this to a crisp hour. But just at the very end, I think it's interesting to reflect on why he wrote the book. But the initial thought is not just the thinness of the presentation, but also the flatness of the prose. He's highly educated, and yet you find the prose to be so uninspired. And when he attempts to be inspired, he lapses into schmautz, which is the Yiddish word for corniness. So that too did surprise me.
I guess I wanted to begin by asking you about the timing of the book, because a core argument of his book is that while anti-Semitism in the United States has been there and it gradually declined in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but there was a rise. I mean, he discusses 2000s, the global financial crisis, but I think the main argument is that after the October 7, it's a strikingly and concerningly there is a rise of anti-Semitism in the United States, and I think it's something that I wanted to have your thoughts on.
Well, there are two aspects to that. The first aspect is there's a long history, which I myself documented in a previous book. It was titled Beyond Chutzpah on the Misuse of Anti-Semitism and the Abuse of History. It was published by University of California Press, in which I showed that whenever Israel is facing a public relations debacle after yet another of its uh, high-tech killings, there is, as a defensive measure, the anti-Semitism is weaponized. The history of Jewish suffering is weaponized in order to uh, stifle the criticism of Israel, to deflect the criticism of Israel. So, beginning in the 1970s, when Israel's stock began to decline, as it became clear that Israel was not going to withdraw from the territories it occupied in 1967, there were these periodic public relations extravaganzas orchestrated. So, beginning in the 1970s, there was these periodic uh, extravaganzas orchestrated by Israel and its American supporters under the rubric of the new anti-Semitism. So you see books published, not one, but a raft of books published each time, usually with the title of the new anti-Semitism. And the usual springboard for this extravaganza was the Anti-Defamation League, the B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation League, which is just an adjunct of the Israeli Foreign Office. And then large numbers of others joined in. So this particular claim that we are now being haunted by some unprecedented anti-Semitism or outburst of anti-Semitism is standard fare for those who know the history. The second point to make is uh, Senator Schumer is slightly schizophrenic on the origin of these outbursts of uh, animus towards Jews. Sometimes it's just part of this age-old cycle. He says that there is this cyclical recurrence of anti-Semitism over the last several thousand years, and that there's a period of prosperity, a period of, so to speak, dislocation, and then there is the outburst of anti-Semitism. So it seems to have no origin. It's, as he calls it, it's timeless in its reach, and there's no obvious cause for it. It's just a recurrent cycle. But then at other points, he says what's happened now in the US was obviously triggered by Israel's reaction after October 7th. The He won't use the word, he rejects the word. I will use the word, but with the clarity that he does not use the word, rejects the word, not just doesn't use it, rejects it, because of the genocide that's unfolding. So it's not just some uh, inexplicable outburst due to this recurrent, inexorable cycle of anti-Semitism. There's a very obvious secular explanation for it. It is a reaction to what Israel is doing in Gaza, which can't make it by his own reckoning. It can't make it anti-Semitism because he says anti-Semitism is always irrational and it's born of the hatred of all of Jews, hatred of Jews, and all things Jewish. Now, the reaction, and we have to gauge the nature of this reaction, whether it exactly who and what it's targeting. But this doesn't have much to do with hatred of all things Jewish. It's not because you hate matzo ball soup, or you hate challah, or you hate latkes. That's not why. It's for better or for worse. It's because you hate what Israel is doing in Gaza. So I found that Schumer was not very consistent on this point. Is this just another chapter in this inexorable cycle of anti-Semitism, or does it have a very clear, it springs from a very clear, a very obvious source? Now, whether it's anti-Semitism or not, I mean, the manifestations of this current phase, that's a separate issue, which we would have to examine. But as to its origins, I think he himself makes clear what its origins are. If you allow me, give me one half moment. Uh, he says already um, on page 2, the second page of the book, he writes, let's find it. Uh, he writes, the October 7 terrorist attack against Israel and the resulting war in Gaza and the ensuing conflict over that war have triggered a rise in anti-Semitism. So it seems like he's very clear that it's not some irrational, inexorable event in history. It has a very concrete cause. At a second place, he writes, um, the ensuing and awful loss of innocent life in Gaza has left many feeling that Israel has not done enough to minimize casualties or provide adequate food, water, and medicine to civilians. In my view, now listen carefully, this is the number one reason Israel is losing support in America. It's not an irrational anti-Semitism. By his own reckoning, there's a very concrete explanation for it. It's called Israel's committing a genocide.
Yeah, I guess you mentioned about his objection to the word phrase genocide. I mean, he also mentions settler colonialism and Zionism is racism, which you might not prefer to use for very different reasons, for intellectual reasons, I suppose. But I guess where I want to take this conversation is the college campus, because he dedicates a lot of this book to college protests. He started with the 1960s anti-war demonstrations where he participated and where he admittedly was opposed to what he called the radical left and the radical right. And from there, he said that even during the protest after October 7. It went too far. And if I can quote a few lines, he said, "To me, many college administrations were too slow to react to anti Semitism in their own backyards and even more hesitant to take disciplinary actions against offenders." And he goes on to effectively endorse what the Trump administration is doing now and what the Biden administration had started. We are also seeing people like David Friedman, potential, U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, openly saying that we would have to lock these people, we would have to cancel their funds, we would have to strip them of their citizenships if possible, and so on and so forth. You had once told that the question of free speech in the United States has now become centrally a question of Gaza, and you have also written this in your book. Can you comment on his writings on the campus protests?
Well, there are several things to say on that point. Number one, there might have been an isolated incident here or there. As you know, you can never prove a negative. You can't prove there wasn't any incidents, but those incidents were clearly blown if they occurred, because I have to always qualify it. If they occurred, those incidents where you can classify them as, let's call it unequivocally anti-Semitic. Um, I'm not sure if that's the best formulation, but we'll use it for now. Those cases were so few and far between, and they were representative of nothing except some marginalia in the grand scheme of things. If you listen to professors uh, who taught at Columbia, have a long history there of having taught, know the students, know the milieu, know the ambiance. People like Bruce Robbins at Columbia University. I was recently in correspondence with him, curious as to what his experiences were. I myself did pass by the encampment at Columbia, and he said, he's Jewish, by the way, there was no anti-Semitism there. In fact, during the period of what was called the second encampment, they made a point of having a Passover Seder in the encampment as a way of showing solidarity between Jews and non-Jews. So the notion that it was rife with anti-Semitism is simply a falsehood. It's a fraud. It's a fabrication. Secondly, uh, there's the issue of what is and what is not permissible under free speech. Now, you have to bear in mind you're a person from India. We have a very robust tradition of free speech in the United States, um, honored in many instances in the breach. I recognize that. I'm not blind to the real life limitations of that robust tradition, but nonetheless, it exists. In our country, there's a very good book written by um, a professor where you currently teach. He was a larger than life figure at the University of Chicago. His name was Harvey Calvin. I think it's Harvey. I have the book here. I'll check it. It's called A Worthy Tradition. And Calvin is very famous because he was the one who authored the famous principles on university neutrality and free speech, which were adopted by many other universities. Are you familiar with Calvin?
No.
Oh, interesting, because he's well known. You'll see his name constantly mentioned in any discussion of campus free speech. The Calvin principles. Basically, he called for absolute university neutrality and full and free uh, discussion of ideas. Um, in any event, so he goes through this history. You have to remember in our country, you're allowed to advocate the violent overthrow of the government. That's a protected constitutional right, uh, defended by Supreme Court decisions. It took a long time for that principle to evolve. There was originally it was a minority position in the court, but eventually it commanded the majority on the court. You have the right to advocate that. And I'll just say on a personal note. So in the 1970s, I was a Maoist, a follower of Chairman Mao. I belonged to a Maoist sect, and we would sit in the 12th floor, 8th or 12th floor of a building in Manhattan, and we were advocating armed struggle to overthrow the capitalist state. And we advocated openly, not just in the privacy of our room. We advocated openly in our newspaper every week, the Guardian newspaper. Okay? Now, we were, of course, sensitive to the possibility of agents provocateurs on our staff who might try to exhort us to do something which was not very smart. But speaking for myself, but I think for everybody there, it never occurred to us that we were doing anything illegal. That never crossed our mind. It was not as if I walked out looking to my left and my right, ready to be snatched off the street and sent to Louisiana. That's not how our country was conducted. That's not how affairs were conducted in our country. And you were not allowed to stifle speech on the grounds that it hurt feelings or made you feel uncomfortable. A signature case in the 1980s was when the Nazi Party wanted to march through the community called Skokie in Illinois, Skokie, Illinois, which was the home to, it was said, many survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. Now we're talking about the Nazi Party. So you could imagine that that would hurt a lot of feelings in Skokie. The state Supreme Court in Illinois ruled they had the right to march. And I can give you a large number of other examples. Remember, during the Vietnam War, there was a large number of very patriotic Americans who did not appreciate the anti-war movement. And one of the acts that became common during the anti-war movement was burning the American flag. And that case also went to the Supreme Court. And our court ruled it was a form of expressive speech, and it was defended. It was defensible under our Constitution. So I bring this all up to say, chanting something like "From the river to the sea, Palestine would be free" is very tame language as compared to what has been ruled by the Supreme Court as defensible under our Constitution. So the attempt to curb this sort of speech is an assault, a frontal assault on a robust tradition defending very wide parameters for freedom of speech. Now, that brings me to my third point. at some points, at some moments in Senator Schumer's book, he says in tentative language, we have to find the right balance between freedom of speech and language which might cross the boundaries into anti-Semitism. So the first obvious point is, no, Mr. Schumer, our Constitution, the Supreme Court rulings, do not allow for those sorts of encroachments. They just don't. I have, and I'm sure he has, very vivid memories over the issue of that march by the Nazis in Skokie. And the ACLU defended the Nazis. In fact, it was the son or actual, I can't remember now. You could check it when you do your research, when we get off the air. His name was Arya, Aryeh, Arya Neyer, Neier. He was, I think, the chief counsel of the ACLU at the time. And he had some connection, maybe tenuous, but some connection with the Nazi Holocaust. And he defended their right. And that brings me to my last point. Every radical movement, as Rosa Luxemburg pointed out, a critical part of a radical movement is the capacity for self-criticism, the need at various junctures for a course correction. It was very striking when you read Senator Schumer's book, and this was illuminating. As I say, most of it was not inspired. But one part of it I found quite illuminating. And that is when he has to defend Israel against the genocide charge. You will have noticed it was a very half-hearted defense. He said, by any fair definition, this is not genocide. The Nazis killed more Jews than Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. But then he quickly says, but the numbers aren't necessarily determinative. It was not what you would call a robust defense. But then what did he do? I wonder if you noticed it yourself. He kept lapsing into the language of, it makes Jews feel bad. It makes them feel unhappy. After what the Jews experienced, a real genocide, this makes them feel bad. And he keeps using that category. It's not whether or not it is a genocide. That's not for him the relevant category. It's how Jews feel about what happened, about the use of the term genocide. And that's, I think it's fair to say, and I'm trying to be absolutely fair, that is the thrust of his argument. And I couldn't help but think this is the residue of woke culture. Because the essence of woke culture on college campuses was to say, if some speech makes you feel unsafe, unwelcome, or uncomfortable, it should be canceled. If it makes you feel unsafe, unwelcome, or uncomfortable, it should be canceled. And so he just appropriated the language of wokeness and weaponized it against the demonstrations at the university. And on that level, unfortunately, he had a case because that was the language that's been deployed since the inception of this horrible thing called wokeness, cancel culture, and all the rest, a complete, total disaster. So I was very struck that, first of all, on its face, what he's saying is, let's put it euphemistically, very implausible. Because if what you're saying is true, that to call Israel genocidal is anti Semitic, that means virtually every judge on the International Court of Justice, including the American judge, was anti Semitic since they found that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. It would mean Amnesty International is anti Semitic because it found that Israel was committing genocide. It would mean that Human Rights Watch was anti Semitic because it found that Israel was committing acts of genocide. So, on its face, it's not, let's just put it this way. If Senator Schumer were serious, he would have attempted to reply to what's now a fairly massive dossier of evidence that Israel is committing genocide. I just printed out yesterday the latest submission by South Africa to the United Nations Security Council, and it runs to 250 single-spaced pages, just documenting Israeli, the rhetoric and the practice of genocide by Israel since October 7th, 2023. And it's been reported that they submitted to the um, ICJ a 750-page dossier with 4,000 pages of documentation. So if you are serious, and let's not be uh, let's not be let's grant him what he deserves. He's a smart guy. He graduated valedictorian of his class in high school. He got a perfect score on the SAT. He may have been the only one at that point. It was a very different kind of test.
He makes a great deal about 800.
Yes, he makes a great deal about, and we call it in Jews called kvelling, Kvelling, meaning boasting, bragging. But the fact of the matter is, I thought to myself, well, you know what? He earned the right to kvel. It was a real achievement. And there's no question, he was a very smart guy. So how do you account for the fact that a very smart guy lapses into the most flabby, insubstantial language, as in it makes us feel bad? I think the obvious answer is because he couldn't answer it. The evidence is too overwhelming. He couldn't answer it. So uh, he he couldn't make an effective reply. And so he lapsed into the language of feelings, which was, as I said, a residue of this horrible woke culture that for a period was dominant in the liberal universities and most universities. I guess I don't know all university faculty, so I don't know what goes on at the University of Alabama. I don't know, or the University of Mississippi. But the what you might call the bi-coastal elite universities, it definitely exercised, as Gramscians would put it, exercised hegemony in these universities, and it had a very baleful influence. Uh, and now, as Malcolm X would say, the chickens came home to roost. The other side weaponized it.
On that note, something that struck me as well was that on one hand, um, in fact, he admitted in the book that I am ringing the alarm bells because he would constantly talk about what happened to the Jews in Europe. He would, of course, the Holocaust is the larger context, but he would constantly talk about what happened to the Jews in Russia in the early 20th century. And he would give all the examples going back to Spain in the 15th century, France in the 14th century, England in the 13th century, even going back to the Romans and the Egyptians, and and when, of course, he primarily discusses the United States, but he would then say that has the situation risen to that level here? He says, of course not. But my task is to raise the alarm bells because you never know when it would reach that stage. So on one hand, you see this extremely, as you said, schizophrenic, hypersensitive, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, when it comes to his discussion about what's actually going on in Palestine towards the end, I mean, I personally felt the chapters, as the book progressed, it became worse and worse because it came closer to the present. The earlier sections were talking about history, of course, although he was not a historian, but it still was just giving you the facts. There he started nitpicking with what genocide is, what settler colonialism is. So on one side, this extreme hypersensitivity about your own cause. On the other side, this total blindness about what's going on in reality.
Well, I have my own theory, I've been around the block. I kind of know how the world works. So if you read Schumer's book, the first 140 pages, for your listeners, the book is 240 pages. The first 140 pages, he just keeps referring to the war in Gaza. The war in Gaza. So why is everybody so excited about the war in Gaza? Wars happen all over the place. After around 140, you'll see he gradually becomes more graphic in his descriptions. Like, this is not quite an ordinary war. There is something very ugly happening among the civilian population. So, what was his strategy there? My guess is the book, as you know, is lethally boring. So he's writing this book. He's obviously not writing the book for non-Jews because no non-Jew is going to read this book. They're not interested. He's writing this book for his donors. Now, why he's doing that, I'll get to, as I said, at the very end. But he knows most of them because most of them are in his age cohort, in their 70s to 80s. They're not going to get past page 140. So, I'll be honest with you. I struggled to get past page 140. I kept turning the page. Okay, how many more pages in this chapter? How many more pages? I just found it so intolerably, insupportably dull. So I think he wrote this book for his donors, and so he figures if he leaves out in the first 140 pages, the ugly parts. He'll get them behind him. They'll be happy. They'll be pleased with his product. And his job is to make them happy. That's his job. So, um, also quite interesting. The word Palestinians doesn't appear until about page 180. There's no mention. He does talk about the 1948 war. He does talk about it. But he never mentions that Palestinians were expelled during the war. He does not. There were two mentions of Palestinians.
Later he does.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to get to. There are two mentions of Palestinians. Uh, One, that they refused these offers for peace, the two-state settlement. I won't go through that history now. But not true, but I'm not going to belabor that now because time doesn't allow us. But then there is on page 205, your readers, your listeners should listen closely. He's addressing the question of whether Israel should be described as a settler colonial state. And he, of course, says no. And then he says it is important to know the history around these events, namely what happened to the Palestinians in 1948. So it's his first mention of what happened in 1948. It occurs on page 205, and the book ends on page 220. So we're talking about 15 pages before the book ends. Suddenly, up until this, as I said, it was prior to this dimension of Palestinians opposing the two-state settlement, that was just in passing. But he has to, he knows, at some point, deal with the beginning of the current round. I know some people want to go back to the Balfour Declaration uh, and so forth, but the current round, you say, begins in 1948, okay? And he says as follows. Here he's again denying, just for your listeners, he's trying to prove Israel is not a settler colonial state. And he says it is important to know the history around what happened in 1948. And he says in November 1947, the UN passed a resolution partitioning Palestine to create two states between the river and the sea, Jewish and Arab, period. It is true that it was expected that Palestinians living within the designated boundaries of the Jewish state would move to the Arab state. So now he's trying to say that the expulsion was no big deal because it was expected that they would move. Where did he come up with that? It's just completely made up. If you read the UN resolution 181, and when you broadcast this, you should put it up on the air, on the screen. It is very explicit about the fact that there has to be equal rights for the minority in both of the states. And they are at pains to emphasize this point. In fact, the state was formed, it was called, it looked as if it was two coiled snakes. It was like this, the state was formed, because the expectation was that they would form an economic union between the two states. There was no thought about a population transfer then. He just made it up. That to me was, I would have to say, it surprised me. The degree of, let's again use the euphemism, disingenuousness. At another point, in order to disqualify the chanters of From the River to the Sea, Palestine will be free, a slogan which I don't like, I've made clear I don't like, but that's beside the point. There are many patriots who don't like our flag being burned. There were many Jews in Skokie who didn't like Nazis marching through their community. You don't get to regulate other people's speech in our country.
There,
So, so
there,
it, it's
there.
it's 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 the beside the point. Just allow me to finish the thought, and now you take over. In any event, he says at one point, those who are chanting from the river to the sea are chanting something that was taken from the Hamas charter. They say he says from the Hamas charter. And I'm thinking to myself, well, when I was a young man in the 1960s and 70s, I'm not particularly proud of it, but I belong to the radical fringe. We chanted from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Hamas charter. Now, here again, I'll kindly ask you, to just go to, when you look at when you air this, go to the American Jewish, just Google From the River to the Sea, the American Jewish Committee, or Google Wikipedia has an article on it's the slogan From the River to the Sea. They all say it goes back to the 1960s. He's just making stuff up as he goes, or whoever wrote the book is making stuff up as the person goes along, you know? Um, so well, we're almost at the end of time. So I just want to speculate on why he wrote the book. Okay? Is that okay? Or you wanted to ask a question?
No, go ahead.
Well, in March of this past year, Schumer gave a major speech in Congress on what was going on in Gaza. And it was a surprising speech. First of all, he called out Netanyahu and basically said Netanyahu has got to go. And number two, when he had to address issues like settler colonialism, and I think in that particular speech, he didn't address the issue of genocide. I know he addressed the issue of settler colonialism, and I think, but you'll go back and check, he addressed the issue of apartheid, calling Israel an apartheid state. And what was striking about the speech was he did not call those allegations anti-Semitic. He patiently tried to parse them so as to demonstrate that in his view, they were, he didn't talk about apartheid, he talked about those who were calling for one state. Those were the two issues he took up were settler colonialism and those calling for one state. And he just calmly attempted to parse those two slogans and why they were, in his view, wrong. But I was very struck at the time because I spoke about it when I read this speech. I think it was when Or Books, my publisher, had an event in New York. I mentioned it because I said it was an indication of how much the um, the spectrum had moved, that now you have to calmly, you can't just call it anti-Semitism. You have to calmly explain why you think it's wrong. So why do I bring it up? Because Schumer bet on the wrong horse. He thought Netanyahu was out. And so he wanted to claim that he was one of the persons who succeeded in ejecting Netanyahu from office. It didn't happen. And his donors were angry at him for what he said in that speech, that he had legitimized, even though he disagreed with, he legitimized talk about one state. He legitimized talk about settler colonialism because he didn't denounce them as anti-Semitic. He just said, I think they're wrong. So he legitimized the conversation about those two issues. And secondly, Netanyahu didn't go. And so, in my view, he wrote the book in order to get back his donors who were not happy with what he said. And so now it was very interesting in the book how he dealt with the Netanyahu issue. He said he opposed Netanyahu because it wasn't good for Israel. That Netanyahu was turning Israel into a partisan issue in the US by aligning with the Republicans, and therefore it would no longer be a bipartisan issue and it would hurt Israel. Secondly, he said that the horrors that are occurring in Gaza, but he doesn't use the word horrors, but some places he goes pretty far. He said that was alienating Americans. So that was hurting Israel. So that's his way of telling his donors, I, I did what I did out of love for Israel. So the whole book, little book, in my view, because it was so poorly conceived and executed, and it was just a mixture of silly apologetics for Israel. It was as if, you know what really struck me? He's not much older than me. He was 4 years ahead of me in high school. I knew his sister in passing because his sister was my best friend's girl, uh, uh, boyfriend. His sister, yes, was my best friend's um,
Girlfriend.
friend. Yes, his sister was my best friend's girlfriend. Yes, so friend, brilliant young woman for sure, for sure. Not just brilliant, she possessed just a lot of. She was an interesting person, an interesting person. Um, so the book is a mixture of cavelling, boasting about his achievements, which I have to acknowledge are impressive. You know, as he puts it, next to the last sentence in the book reads, the United States is a country where the Jewish son of an exterminator and a housewife could one day become the leader of the United States Senate. It is an impressive story. There's no taking away from that. But it was such a, it was like my impression when I walked away from it, it was like, he's not much older than me, as I said, he's 4 years older than me. But it was as if he were frozen in time. It wasn't written by a 74-year-old. It felt to me like it was written by a 94-year-old. It's old mythology from the 1970s. It's like he doesn't even know all the new scholarship, which isn't even new anymore. The new historians are 30 years ago in the mid to late 1980s. I mean, the book is so frozen in time, and I'll leave it off here. When I was a kid, there was a movie. It was called Exodus. Okay, very famous movie. I think the person who made it was Otto Preminger. And the signature song, the director was Otto Preminger. And the signature song in the movie it went like this. It was sung by this guy named Pat Boone, who was kind of a teeny bopper idol back then. This land is mine. God gave this land to me. And every Jewish boy took piano lessons. And that was one of the things we all learned to play. Bum, 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 bum. I remember my mother, for altogether different reasons, she used to go, yeah, God gave this land to you, because she hated any notion of God. So whenever it says God gave this land, she would get so indignant, not because of Palestinians or anything, but just by the idea of God gave you this land. And at some point in the book, as I'm sure you know this, or I'm not sure if you know this because it wouldn't leap out to you, he says at one point, let me just get it for you. He says on page 155, He says, to some of us, meaning Jews, Israel is a biblical homeland, a place of destiny that our people were promised by God. In the lyrics of the song from the film Exodus, this land is mine, God gave. Are you serious? You're, dra- you're drawing on that Schmaltz song in a in a book that's supposed to be a serious inquiry into the origins of anti-Semitism. And then at the end, the guy who boasts about his perfect 800s several times and then devotes a whole paragraph. Again, a real achievement, but as I call it in something I'm writing, this over-the-top kvelling, um, he quotes Bill Maher. That's your authority? I mean, why not quote Destiny?
On the quotation thing, he mentions at one place that right after October 7, not only there were uh, shows of solidarity, some renowned scholars, I don't remember he used the word renowned, they wrote they were exhilarated. Was that an indirect reference to you? I mean, he's not
No, I don't
okay.
think so. I think it was Joseph Mossad at Columbia had written something like that because he put it in quotes, and I didn't use that word.
Right, yeah. So I was confused. Of course, he doesn't cite anything.
I mean,
So
I'm not trying to distance myself from what I said.
yeah,
I
yeah.
kept it up, and I don't believe in a censorship. I kept everything up that I said, and I don't have any regrets about it. I made those statements on the basis of what the knowledge was at the time. And as you will recall, it took about 3 or 4 days before, at least in the U.S., it took till Saturday or Sunday. I think the first news was on Thursday. That's my memory, but I could be wrong. But it wasn't until Saturday or Sunday before the full dimensions of what had happened. And then I had to seriously think it through, in light of this new evidence, where do I stand? So I'm not trying to distance myself, but I don't think it was me. I don't think so.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head about the how you concluded because that was my feeling. In fact, he was very categorical. He said very categorically that I'm writing this book to keep the bipartisan support alive in the United States, and
I don't actually believe that's why he wrote the
I
book.
mean, you say it's
I
because
mean, I
to
think
assuage the donor.
his donors.
Yeah, but that's what he. I mean,
He
the
burnt
most
the bridge in March
right.
of 2024, and now he wanted to rebuild it. And that
Yeah,
was the price he had to pay.
yeah.
Because the tone is very different from the speech. Go back and read his speech. The speech was just very matter of fact. Well, one thing, as I said, was surprising. He was calling for Netanyahu's ouster.
Yeah, but I guess the important point here also to note is that there was in the middle of a mobilization. The election was due. There was a mobilization, and there was an internal discussion and debate within the Democratic Party that
That's not
what would be
working
a
point.
yeah, and that
Totally
all that
correct.
those things have gone now.
Totally correct. Totally correct. Because there was a large part of the Democratic Party base that was very restive and in rebellion at what Biden et al. Were doing. So yes, you're absolutely correct. Part of it was to try to keep that base in tow. That's definitely correct. And now, as you say, that's ancient history. They lost the election, and now his main job is to keep his donors in tow.
And there is no mention of donors. I mean, there are so many
Yeah, I
quotations
know.
of
I know.
social media, and he dedicated a
Right.
chapter on social media. But
Right.
there is no mention on. I mean, he talks a lot about Soros, and he's probably right, but he doesn't mention about Jewish donations and its impact on universities.
Yeah, all that is whited out. There's nothing about AIPAC. There's
Right.
nothing about the Jewish lobby. There's nothing about how many candidates were defeated by that lobby.
Correct.
All of that is gone. It's as if he has no material stake in this. No, he has a very big material stake. He was the one who went to the Orthodox Jewish rabbis in 2010 and said he called for, and I'm quoting him now, the economic strangulation of Gaza. That's Mr. Schumer, in order to ingratiate himself with his donors.
He also feels very proud of attempting to sabotage the JCPOA negotiations with Iran, which they
That was,
did.
and that was his donors also. There are only, as my memory is, the only two Democratic senators who opposed the agreement with Iran were Schumer and Menendez in New Jersey, and both for the same reason. The thing with people like Schumer, you never know. You know, the human capacity for self-deception is infinite, and you don't know whether he really believes what he's saying or he's just totally cynical and inside he says, "Oh, I know this is all BS, but that's what I have to do to keep my donors." You know, you don't know. Parts of it were just nonsense. I mean, I know that era. He says we used to sit around the table talking about the Holocaust. Stop it.
Did you read his mention about Rosa Luxemburg? He says he
Yeah,
quotes one of his professors
I'm
saying that
sure it was Adam Ulam.
ah,
I'm positive it was Adam Ulam.
that was incredible. That
Yeah,
she was someone who believed so much in humanity, but never liked a single human being that
right,
she faced.
right. Have you ever read her letters?
No.
Rosa Luxemburg's letters, really, in the annals of world literature, they rank up there. They're so thrilling.
I've read her books on writings on Poland, Russia, and so on and so
No,
forth, but
no,
not her
her
letters.
personal letters are breathtaking. You know how many times I've read them and how many times I'm so saddened I can't, there aren't more. They're so beautiful. They're so exhilarating. It was just such a stupid remark.
Right.
Adam Ulam, Professor Chomsky's, one of his sons, Harry, he calls it the catastrophe, he called it. The catastrophe. What was the catastrophe? He said, when I got a B in Adam Ulam's course on Russian history, and he said to me, Adam Ulam, your listeners won't have any idea who he is, but he was this right-wing anti-Soviet writer, historian, and he wrote a book on the 1917 revolution called The Bolsheviks, and it was standard in classes. We all read it. And he said, Adam Ulam was famous at Harvard as being the only professor who fell asleep during his own lectures. So I'm sure he was the one that said that about Rosa Luxemburg. So stupid. You know, it's kind of sad. I have to say, when you become an apparatchik, the mental devolution, the mental degeneration, it was such a bad book. There wasn't, there wasn't, I mean, he has a great story, but there was totally, it leaves you totally flat. There was that, where is that passage? I 1 second. I'm sure I won't be able to find it. I know how to find it. Let's see. Hmm. Huh, that's strange. 1 second. So he talks about his family, his distant family that was exterminated during the Nazi Holocaust. And he writes as follows. And he's trying, you can see, he's trying to be poetic. He's making an effort. And he writes, sometimes as a kid, I tried to picture them, those long distant Schumers, living half a world away and half a lifetime ago. Did they look like me? What kind of food did they eat? Did they ride their bikes on the weekend like I did? Who were their friends, neighbors, school crushes? Did they like to dance? If so, to what music? It's so pitiful. You know, I have in my living room, I have pictures of my parents, one of my parents, my mother's family. The pictures survived the war. Now, occasionally, I look at the pictures. I look at the picture of my mother's mother. It never occurred to me to ask the question, did she ride her bike on the weekend? It's so stupid.
Yeah, no, that can be like, as a student of history, that can be a broader, historical reflection about, like, in the 18th century, what kind of food people eat. But that's not about my family. That's a broader
Look,
curiosity.
my friend, this was pitiful prose of an emotionally impoverished mind. That's it. I'm serious. I'm reading this. I'm thinking, this is the best you could do. This is the poignant moment in the book where he's trying to tap his emotional resources. And this is the best you can do. The prose. Oh, God.
Let's leave it.
You should read Rosa's letters.
I will.
That's
Let's
dazzling.
let's leave it there, Professor Finkelstein. Thank you so much for your time.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.